for recording in progress, for those introductions. Tim, before we start, do you want to say a word about Conservation 50, or should we leave that to the end?
Yes, I just welcome everybody. I hope you can hear all right. It keeps on saying my internet is not stable. So if I sound disappear, I do apologise in advance. Yes, just in terms of the fee I'm getting for this talk, it's going towards Conservation 50. And there are two big projects that they're undertaking, exciting projects at the moment. One is working with a variety of other organisations, blue plaques for St Albans, and the other is to try and redecorate and brighten up our city alleyways, which have become rather neglected. So part of your fee tonight is going on a very good cause. Can I say I'm very grateful to Nina for agreeing to be the interviewer in this talk. The genesis of this talk goes back a long way, and I talked to Caroline Godden about having a debate about free will between St Augustine and Pelagius. And this was a 5th century debate. They never actually met, so it wouldn't have been a real debate, but of course it was a debate in words about free will. And it was going to be, and this will make you rather disappointed, it was going to be an evening session in the abbot's kitchen with alcohol being served and everybody being able to engage in the debate. Well, thanks to COVID, of course, that got completely smashed and we had to give up on that. So I then thought it might be interesting to have a conversation, and I twisted Nina's arm, not too much twisting, but I twisted her arm and she very kindly agreed to be the interviewer in this. So I'm going to hand back to Nina and she can start us off.
Yes, if I may say so, you were determined, weren't you, Tim, to put this on? So yes, the free will versus determinism debate is an ancient and enduring philosophical puzzle based around arguments about the subjective experience of freedom, on sentiments of guilt, on revealed religion, and on the universal position of responsibility for personal actions that underlie modern concepts, as well as historical, of law, punishment, and incentive. So it's very sprawling. I have to say I'm not completely at home in it, so I'm going to hopefully learn a lot, as will all of you. Tim is encyclopedic as ever. So I thought we might start by simply asking him, what is meant by free will?
I think that's a good place to start, isn't it? Well, just to battle you to start with, of course, it's a metaphysical concept. It isn't a reality. It's an idea that we've generated. And the idea is behind everything that we do, we have a choice, and we could do other. And our free will allows us to choose one thing. We are the agents, we take the action, and that is our free will. And throughout history, it has been a really important subject matter for humans to think about ever since we became conscious creatures. So it doesn't matter whether you're a philosopher or whether you're an anthropologist or whether you're a scientist or whether you're a psychologist. The idea of free will and really have free will, or whether our lives are entirely determined by, and I'll come on to what they might be determined by later, it's a subject that engages all of us. Intuitively, you have free will. You chose to come here tonight. I hope no one forced you. We're not. We're not in North Korea. Forced to turn on your computers and listen to me tonight. So you made a choice. You decided maybe it was a mistake. You decided not to go out in the fresh air and enjoy a summer evening. You decided to get glued to the computer and listen to quite an esoteric sort of conversation about free will. So just to finish that, intuitively, we all think we've got it. And what I want to explore tonight in our conversation with Nina is whether that demonstrate that and prove it.
Fab. Thanks, Tim, for that intro. So yes, either people have free will, in which case their actions are not determined by their circumstances, or past experience, or psychological or personality traits, or they don't have free will, in which case they're predetermined, and so they can never take moral responsibility, which is something we'll maybe come to later. But before that, if we go a bit back into the history, when and why did the concept of free will appear? You've already...
Well, yes, it goes back a long way in human history. We can go back to the first literature. Some of you will be familiar with the poem, the Sumerian poem of Gilgamesh. And Gilgamesh is this heroic figure who can't really come to terms with his mortality. And what he's trying to explore throughout the poem is really, what is it to be human, and why do things happen? Do they happen arbitrarily, or do you have some sort of control? And then you can move to Homer, of course, and both the Iliad and the Odyssey. But the Odyssey in particular, there's this thing called fate, which constantly controls what's happening to Odysseus on his way back. So the beginnings of the literature there are about really who's in control. Are we in control? Are we making our own choices, or is something, some other force happening elsewhere? And then leading us on a little bit further, of course, we get into the whole area of divine power. And is it God or the gods? And as an anthropologist, I know that every human culture that we've ever studied all have a divinity of some sort. So are the divine forces predetermining what happens to us, and are they in control of us?
Yeah, perfect. I mean, so Mike Cross has just asked, how would you know that you're not being directed? I think it's interesting, even the words we use, forcing or directing, and the etymology behind them. Can you say anything to that, Tim?
We're going to come on to that in more detail later, but just to pick up on that, and because it's a very good question, isn't it? How do we know? The problem for us as human beings, of course, is we've got our consciousness, but it's subjective. It's limited to us. So we can see outside forces, but in a way we interpret them. So we don't know whether we ourselves have some elements of predetermination. We may say, well, I'm making a free choice, but am I really? I'm always amused by the song from West Side Story, and some of you will know the Bernstein West Side Story, which involves the gang, and they're stopped by the police officer, Officer Krupke, and they go through a litany of saying, well, look, it's not our fault we're bad boys, because our mother was awful, our father was a drunkard, and so on and so forth. So environment has made us what we are. But of course, if I go back to the point I was making about it being subjective, what's going on in our heads is the crucial element, and we'll come onto that in sort of more detail. If I can move slightly onwards, because the origins, I say the genesis of me thinking about this was really a theological debate, and the theological debate was about God being omniscient, all in control, and yet bad things happening to human beings, and then even more interestingly, human beings doing bad things. And this, of course, free will, and I didn't mention it earlier, but free will engages with morality and law and all our behaviors and how we behave. And we wouldn't, would we, if someone is forced to do something, we wouldn't necessarily blame or shame them for their actions. However, if they've done it out of free will by themselves without any coercion, then they would be censored by society as having broken morality. So there's that bit. But I'll come back to the question about how do we know, is there someone inside me pulling the strings? We'll come back to that.
Yeah, so free will, therefore, is presupposed by the notion of moral responsibility. And Aristotle said some things to that end. I was also going to pick up on, you mentioned Homer and the phenomenon of double causation. So wherein a god intervenes, but the human is still somehow responsible because they're a rational being. And obviously Aristotle speaks to that. Tim.
And everybody knows about Aristotle. One of his most interesting works, and one devoted to ethics, of course, is the Nicomachean, which was named after his son. And in book 3 there, he does tackle the problem of free will. And he's slightly, again, ambiguous about it, but he does believe, because we are rational, because we can think about an idea, come to a conclusion that then determines our behavior, that we do have free will. And that was reinforced later on in the Roman world by a very interesting Stoic philosopher, and some of you will have heard of him, Epictetus. Now, why Epictetus is so interesting in terms of free will, that he was actually a slave who gained freedom. So he knew what it was like to be coerced into doing things, because he didn't have free will for much of his life. And it was later that he had his musings, really, his Stoical musings, which said, and they weren't so interested really in how you made the decisions, but they were interested in how you received what happened to you, as Stoicism is. And the basis of Stoicism, very simply, the basis is that whatever happens to you, you deal with it in a rational and sensible manner. So you're getting over, if you like, your animal reactions, the fight and flight, the emotion, the tears, and so on. You're just acting, doesn't matter whether it's good fortune or it's bad fortune. You receive it in the same rational, sensible way, calmed way. And that's as I say, that's a potted version, but that's what lies behind Stoicism there. And Epictetus is very interesting because he did believe that there was free will, but that free will was guided by the divine. And we'll come into that in more detail, obviously, when we come into Christianity.
Yeah, and thinking back to my degree, there were some fantastic French plays, particularly looking at Stoicism. And obviously the cornerstone of tragedy is that conflict between the heroes or the anti-heroes' free will and what they're kind of fated to achieve. And blame, shame, transgression. If you haven't read Sartre's Les Mouches, the Flies, that's a fantastic one, looking at freedom and moral responsibility and bad faith and how if you act inauthentically to do with values that are presupposed on you, you're living in bad faith and you're a bad person somehow. Anyway, but fascinating literature there as well, or on the stage.
Nina, we're probably not all as skilled in languages as you. Did you read it? Did you read it in the original French?
The French the way Sartre writes is very short. Huis clos is another. I don't know quite how that's translated, but the closed doors. It's very fast sentences. So even with basic French, you can muddle your way through, and it's all pretty muddling anyway. But it's good fun.
Well, I think you've solved the holiday problem for several people. You won't be able to can't go to France at the moment.
It will leave you feeling a bit.
You can just read Sartre at home. That's the answer.
Yeah, it's very, very timely. We can just leave. Anyway, so do all humans have a concept of free will? You spoke about the slave and how, he wasn't free, literally and really. So do all humans have it, even those who are less free objectively?
Yes, I mean, I suppose if we stick still with the ancient world, and before we move into the Christian world, if we think about Oedipus, this is the classic one, isn't it? Oedipus it's predetermined. He's going to kill his father, marry his mother, etc., etc. And there's no way he can escape out of that, though he takes actions. He raised his sword and killed his father. He fell in love and married his mother, and so on. So there's this double bind that, although it's all predetermined, he also has the freedom to take those actions, and of course, as was mentioned earlier, he takes the blame and the shame and the punishment for doing that. So there's that ambiguity which runs all the way through. Wherever theology meets with philosophy, there is this sense of a divine power that has some responsibility for human actions, and yet at the same time, human beings can't escape the individual responsibility that goes with those actions. So it's quite a tricky area. I guess, Nina, we could come on to talk about early Christianity and how that gets involved.
Yeah, I mean, that's perfect. I was just going to ask, obviously the Romans had multiple gods, and how did the kind of the picture change? I was just learning today about Alban's martyrdom and how he broke that bind. Yeah, how did it evolve as Western early Christianity did?
So if we move to talk about monotheism and the Christian God, and it goes back to the point I was making about God being omniscient and in control and knowing what is going to happen, how then do we explain, first of all, free will, but also what control human beings may have in terms of how they live their lives? The 4th century, it became an interesting subject, and it was actually, that was where the whole concept free will was coined. I think in Latin it's liberum arbitrium, and that literally means a free decision. You make a free decision. But it became crucially important in the 4th century with St. Augustine. And St. Augustine was following St. Paul. He was very keen on Paul and interpreting Paul, and he saw that God was omniscient and omnipotent, and yet human beings at the same time made mistakes. I mean, he's because he's famous for writing in his Confessions, which is his most interesting book, I have to say. He wrote in that continent, but not just yet. And St. Augustine had a mistress, and he was clearly still enjoying his relationship with her. He had an illegitimate son, and he knew on one level he shouldn't be doing all of this, but at the same time, he thought because allowing this to happen, then it was something he could row back from. But he was really keen on understanding the relationship between human beings and their behavior when God could control that behavior. So why doesn't God make us all good and then we just the proper way? And his answer to this, and many of you will know this, of course, was that we have original sin. And it was the sin of Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden that then was passed down through concupiscence, sexual intercourse, down through the next generation to the next generation to the next generation. Babies were born with original sin. And he proved this because sometimes a baby will cry for no apparent reason. And that's a baby just behaving badly, and it's the original sin coming out. And it's sort of a rather awful explanation. But behind that, there's something much more interesting and more serious, which is about how a human being who breaks breaks the law and shames and carries out a sin, how a human being can then be saved. Now, Pelagius, who was a British theologian, argued that human beings could save themselves through their behavior. So with good behavior, they could reach heaven. And it was up to human beings to live a pure life. And Pelagius was slightly aesthetic in the way he lived his life. St. Augustine said this is not right, this is wrong, because in fact, human beings don't have that power. The only person who can save us is God himself through his grace. So it's God's grace that actually saves us. It doesn't mean to say we should just go off and behave very badly and we'll be forgiven, because we don't know. It's God's grace, and because that cannot be determined by mankind, by human beings, therefore it is bestowed in a way that we don't understand. It's beyond our understanding. So we have to live with the fact that we are born with original sin. We have to try and lead good lives, but that doesn't necessarily mean that we will be saved in the end, which seems a bit harsh. when I was first teaching early Christianity and dealing with this period, I was very anti-St. Augustine, I have to say, and I did read him at some length, and I didn't feel that this was a very liberal or democratic approach to being a human being, because if we inherit all these things, it's predetermined by our ancestors, and that's not really fair. However, I've moved a little bit more towards St. Augustine, and the reason I've moved more that way, of course, is because science has taken that way through DNA and through genes and the things that we inherit, which not only what we look like, but also scientists can demonstrate now how we have genes that affect our behavior. So St. Augustine may have actually been thinking about a scientific truth, although of course he was looking at it from a theological point of view.
Yeah, and I remember even in school learning if God was good, what the justification for evil and suffering in the world was. I think the answer was at that point that we just got told to write out without necessarily having to have this conversation, that it was free will and that we're punished perhaps not for our sins, but by our own sins. And how does the free will debate play out in other monotheistic faiths, for example, Islam? Is there much there that we could draw?
Well, it's fairly similar in a sense, because the monotheistic religions all have this single God who by his or her very nature controls the world. And it's linked in a way almost to natural law, in that natural laws are God's laws, and therefore that control of the universe and the planet Earth and the human beings is within that God's control. There are ways of reaching God, and as you say, it's not, the free will is our opportunity to create that connection. That's the key to it, and we may spurn that opportunity, but the free will should require us to do that for making good judgments, good points. So it has an element of belief in it, of course, but also an element of rationality. But it's something we should do for our own benefit, for humankind's benefit. We should reach out to God in that way. It's interesting. I mean, St. Augustine's view very much coloured the early church, but it changed as European society began to become more enlightened. It began to change. So, for example, Aquinas in the 14th century was saying, well, yes, free will, the basis of free will, and that is about our ability to make good judgments and also to reflect on what we've done and reconsider where we're going. So it becomes a rational intellectual exercise. And of course, that becomes more interesting later on. We'll talk about the psychology of free will and how that works inside our heads. But Aquinas then set that sort of benchmark, and of course, he's then followed with the Enlightenment. And with the Enlightenment, then we have a more rational approach to understanding our choices, why we do one thing and not the other, what is influencing us, and how we make good judgments, and how also people make bad judgments, because then that becomes enshrined in law. And motivation is still a very important part of Western law. It's not universally across all societies, but Western society, you are judged on the motivation. So the ultimate capital offence, for example, of killing someone, it's treated quite differently if it's a crime of passion, done in an instant, than one that is carefully premeditated and calculated, because that demonstrates free will being used in entirely the wrong way. So the Enlightenment begins to develop that. You've got people like Hobbes and wonderful Scottish philosopher David Hume looking at free will in a more rational, less theological way, but a more philosophical way in terms of understanding human behavior without necessarily having the control of a God influencing that free will.
Yes, thank you. So yes, you've given pretty much a definition there for a free will, but then what, on the other hand, can you just clarify, is determinism, or being predetermined to do something?
Right. Well, this now we move also into areas of science, because as the Enlightenment developed, we saw there are laws of nature, and laws that govern our behaviour are part of those laws of nature. And you could call it cause and effect. There's a cause for something which creates something, and that's all physical properties. We can see that happen. Does it also happen within our heads, in the sense, in terms of our free will and how we behave? Is there, and this goes back to the question, how do I know that someone isn't pulling the strings inside my head? Is something always predetermined? Is it predetermined? And do we have any escape from that predetermining? So determination, and it comes in various forms, could be biological determination, which says everything is determined by our biology. It could be a determination by our genes, our DNA. It could be determination by our environment. Well, that's the Geoffrey Krupke. No wonder I've turned out so bad. Look where I came from. So those areas are creating that determination. In terms of how philosophers look at this, you've got the view of the hard-line determinists, which say everything is determined. We have actually no free will. It's just we do not understand it, because we cannot stand back outside ourselves and see what is predeterminating something. I mean, it's a bit almost like the chaos theory. You know, a butterfly has just flapped its wings in Australia, and we will feel the effect at some point, because for whatever action there is a reaction, and we're thinking in sort of physical terms there. So things will be determined even if we cannot see the source or the cause of what is determining things happening to us. The danger is that, makes you feel just like a robot, but there is someone pulling those strings and you're going in that way. But determination has had some reinforcement from particularly areas like neuroscience. Shall I go on to talk about that, Nina? Is that a good point to talk about neuroscience?
Yeah, well, is that soft determinism and compatibilism, or is it still straight determinism? Is there a kind of is it an either or is it a sliding scale? Is it a spectrum?
Yes, labels that are given to philosophers. So if you believe in compatibility in that sense, you are a compatibilist. You say that it's quite compatible to have things that are determined and yet at the same time exercise free will. There's a balance between that you are making assumptions, though much of what lies behind those judgments has already been determined. The incompatible and hard line determinists say when you come down to illusion, that we are all controlled by laws of cause and effect, and they themselves are influenced by natural laws. So whatever we think we're doing, that doesn't work. Now, neuroscience is being used to understand the brain and how that might work. And some of you may have come across someone called Benjamin Libet. Now, Benjamin Libet started experiments to see whether, when we made a decision, what was the relationship between our brain, consciousness, and the action we took. And that his experiments have been followed up, and we've now got so much better ways of seeing what the brain does. For example, an MRI scan, we can actually watch it in real time and see what happens. And what Libet put forward, and now seems to have been substantiated fairly well, that when you do an action, raise your hands. I've just raised my hand. Before I'm consciously raising my hand, my subconscious, my brain, has already triggered that off. How this has been generally demonstrated is by putting human beings in experimental situations where they have to make choices and monitoring their brains, and you can actually see the decisions in the brain taking place before people are conscious they've made that decision. So every conscious act we make is actually based on history. And of course, predetermination itself is based everything on what's happened in the past. And as we can't go back into the past, well, we may be able to if in one of those other universes, but at the moment, on this universe, we can't go back into the past conscious of that decision. It's already been made subconsciously, and our conscious then just rationalizes it. And of course I was going to kick that football. Of course I was, because I saw the goal there and there was an opportunity. But actually, subconsciously, I'd already made that decision. Now that is interesting in a way because, of course, it puts us closer to our animal cousins, who don't, as far as we are able to tell, have consciousness. So they make whole sets of instinctive decisions. They do things, and there's no rational reason for them doing it, other than their instinct. And it's usually to do with survival. It's usually to do with surviving either against predators or actually then finding a meal for themselves or whatever it needs to do. But it's reaction to a predetermined stimulus that creates that. So we could, if we move ourselves there, say, well, a lot of our actions are just animal actions in that way. And I mentioned this earlier to Nina because it's a horror story, actually. It's horrible. But often to my students, I was always using this example of road rage as the most irrational action, which was a fight or flight mechanism that people rushed into. When the obvious thing is, someone carves you up at a roundabout or in a motorway in your car, the most obvious rational reaction is to get away from that motorist as fast as possible. But we all tend to react, lose our tempers, wave our fists, do something irrational. And why it came to my mind was that I read a terrible story in a news feed today about in America where a road rage occurrence took place and a man pulled out a gun and fired at the other car, hitting a baby in the back seat and killing it. I mean, now we could get into a discussion about America and guns, but the point about that is we all often have emotional reactions to things, which if we were rational, we would not behave in that way. So that's another sort of bit of evidence in a way that we're often controlled by our emotions and not by rational thinking, which is behind free will choices, that we're driven by, if you like, our nature rather than by our rationality.
Fantastic. Thanks, Tim. That's, a horrendous example, but serves the point well. I'd love to get back to animals and the idea of animal agency a bit more later, because I think that's really important as well in terms of how we're interconnected and how the world kind of looks in the billions of years that humans may or may not continue to exist. I also wanted to ask, when you were talking about the unconscious or it inevitably, or maybe this is not inevitable, but thinking of Freud and how he looked at trauma and how that completely informed all of your future choices, and other people have disproved or vehemently disagreed with him. But actually the mental illness does often seem to undermine the concept of free will, because people just lose complete faculties over rational actions or thoughts. I'm not sure if you have any. That was more of a comment than a question from me.
But it is important, isn't it, in that sense, because the law is based on, and going back to this, the idea of motivation, which is free will. And the terrible case of today, where a sister's been stabbed to death, and the guy was doing it so he could win. He had the devil, we're told, so he could win the lottery. And you think, well, that shows total mental instability. Can we judge him on the same basis we would judge someone who premeditatedly, deliberately killed someone to make financial gain? It's the dividing line there is very tricky, and I have heard some forensic psychologists say that the majority of people in our prisons actually have a mental problem as much as a problem of free will and criminality. That they've got a mental problem which puts them in a position where they're not thinking rationally, and they behave outside the moral standards and consequently outside law of our society. So there is an issue there. And then picking up again on Freud and Freudian theories, which are discounted by many psychoanalysts and psychologists today. Nevertheless, he got us thinking about our inner selves, and in particular thinking about the forces that drive us in what he called the unconscious. I talked about previously the subconscious in a way, but we know, 90% of the brain in that sense is working in a subconscious way because it's driving all things. I'm as I talk to you now, I'm waving my hands about. And it's not a conscious decision, but as I want to say something, you might say, well, it's a cultural thing, but it's obviously part of behavior and communication, which I've probably inherited. What is interesting now, and some of you will have probably read up about this, is that where we were, where biologists were generally very against Lamarck and Lamarckism, that you just didn't inherit things from your parents and pass it on. It now seems that really is possible. So the idea of natural selection, which was completely Darwinian in the sense the survival of the fittest, that's also now being tempered with the idea that you can actually pass some inheritable genes on to your offspring who will behave in certain ways. Japanese have done quite a lot of work on this with monkeys, and they've seen that actually working out. One of the experiments you may have seen was monkeys on an island who were isolated, and they were being fed with rice. And generations learnt to sieve that rice in the sea to get rid of the grit and the sand, and they don't seem to have been able to do that through observation. They seem to have been able to naturally understand it. And that looks like it was something that was passed on not through natural selection necessarily, but by being able to pass that inheritance down to the next generation.
Yes, I think I've heard a similar experiment, but I'm not sure if it was made easier, but monkeys climbing up a ladder, they weren't allowed to. If a single monkey of the group did, they would get sprayed by cold water. And then they found out there wasn't a single original monkey, but the monkeys still knew not to climb this ladder, which I thought was fascinating. If we go back just a tiny bit to the kind of the cruelty of mental illness and how it feeds into the free will debate, and also the kind of humanistic approach, which sometimes, at least in our prisons, ends up not being very humane because it kind of looks at people being self-determined or self-actualized, and this myth potentially of meritocracy, and people taking responsibility for their own poverty, even though we know that that's very much often not the case, once poor, always poor. But whether we are imprisoning people for their crimes, actually, or for their kind of their history, if I use Mike's wording, do you imprison people because of their crimes or because of the defects in their mental health, which makes them unsafe? Obviously, not really the latter, but how do we then deal with people that aren't?
I think it's a very engaging problem. I think we think more about it, particularly as we tend to fill our prisons up, and the law inevitably, in terms of its cultural development, is always behind. So the ways of thinking, and I think the idea that imprisonment is going to solve issues with criminality is probably wrong. It does have, of course, a punishment and a revenge element to it, and as human beings, we very often want that. It's a form of justice, but it doesn't actually solve criminality itself. And the evidence suggests, in fact, that prisons often become criminal schools where you become educated in more criminality or not. I noticed, I don't know, Nina, it looks like my picture's gone very, very dark.
You're kind of fading out. Hopefully you'll see.
I don't know if I can try and get some more light on it. That seems better. Is that better?
Much better.
Yes, I think as the evening went on, I just saw us gradually getting darker and darker. Sorry, that interrupted our flow, but
yes, no, very good. And we were also, so we spoke a bit about neuroscience and how modern science has begun to inform a different way of looking at things. Psychology is obviously a relatively new discipline compared to philosophy and religious studies and theology. So I don't want to launch you in the deep end with quantum physics, because that seems a bit cruel. But I would alert people, just to kind of preface this discussion with, you can probably find a better one elsewhere, is a lecture that Stephen Hawking gave in 1999 called "Does God Play Dice?" And obviously that's from Einstein, who wrote "God does not play dice" because he was annoyed or unhappy about the apparent randomness in nature. And this lecture looked at the arbitrariness of disasters in medieval times, and they would kind of attributed to natural phenomena, that is, or floods or droughts were attributed to kind of the whims of gods and goddesses. And Stephen Hawking just takes us on this really interesting journey through various 20th century and then 21st century discoveries of the black hole and what that means for randomness and uncertainty and being able to predict the future, which is, I guess, what all these sci-fi things are wanting to do. And how that, whether we can forget all of the kind of historical stuff or whether it still isn't just as relevant as all this new scientific understanding. What do you think, Tim?
You've led us into the area of quantum mechanics, which is very fascinating, because there is an element within quantum mechanics of randomness, and let me explain how that might work. You're observing some particles and the movement of those particles. It seems that where you create the observation, where you put the observation, the particles will then behave differently. And this is a bit of a conundrum for quantum physics in terms of what is the law, the natural law, which is governing the movement of those particles, if they appear to be relative in terms of their movement, depending on where you observe them from. Of course, we do know in quantum mechanics, you can actually create an understanding. I mean, the Higgs boson particle, which was predicted by Higgs long before it was actually observed, but it could be observed. And there's another particle just recently which they believe they've discovered, which could be a very important particle in understanding how the universe works. So the tendency is, yes, there might appear to be some randomness in what is going on, but then this picks up on Hawking's sense that, in a way there will always be some form of determined explanation. We just haven't been able to see the predetermination of it entirely yet, because we fully don't understand the cosmos and how exactly it works. A good example was dark matter. You may have read recently that a map has been produced of dark matter, and it surprised astronomers and scientists because they had not understood there was so much dark matter around. They had not been able to, well, it's a paradox, and how do you observe dark matter? Which of course you don't observe it, you only observe it by the light being bent at some other place.
Black holes are out of sight. Yeah.
Yes, but so that there are things that we still need to discover about natural law, which of course will help in the idea of predetermination. Can I shift us a bit, because you started, Nina, on the psychology part, and I think the psychology of this is very interesting because it goes back to what is happening in our minds and how we work. Being made now, and you will understand there's often an analogy now between computers and human beings in the terms of the way we work and the way our brain works. And we know that there's all sorts of things happening, synapses going off everywhere in our brains, and how that might possibly be related to computational ideas. We certainly know that, and it's one of the characteristics of consciousness and being a human being, that babies, for example, who are helpless long beyond any other species of mammal or any other animal, are helpless because they are having to be brought into the world. They're brought prematurely so their brains can expand, and they're absorbing, and what they absorb is very important in terms of then their interpretation of the world. And sometimes, I mean, we know that work has been done, and I probably mentioned this before, but we know that some communities which are cut off have a different way of seeing the world from, say, a Western culture. One obvious one, the terrible story I always tell about the anthropologist who was studying groups in Papua New Guinea, and he'd come across a group that had never seen an anthropologist or an outsider before. So he thought, the way to introduce myself is to drop lots of photographs So his plane went over and they dropped lots of photographs. Then he went in, and of course, they decided to eat him for lunch. The point being that they could not interpret a two-dimensional photograph and turn it into a three-dimensional person. So their way of seeing was quite limited. And there have been some cases now of people who have been given their sight back, who were born without any sight, but have achieved sight later in life, and they've had enormous difficulties in interpreting the world because they hadn't been through that process that babies and infants go through in learning how to understand the world. So taking us back into the free will domain, our understanding of how we think and what determines what we do may well be conditioned in a way that we don't fully understand, and that our choices, therefore, are actually illusionary. They are within our heads. I can't prove at this moment that you out there exist at all, or I'm even giving this talk or conversation with Nina, because I can't stand outside myself and be objective. Now, of course, philosophy has dealt with this in various ways, and the famous one is kicking of the tree and refuting Berkeley and so on. But existentially, I can't actually demonstrate the truth of that. So it may be what's going on is entirely in my head, and therefore my illusion that I've made choices to do things like having this conversation tonight is actually fabricated illusion. It hasn't really happened. It was predetermined in some other way. So there's our interpretation of the world, I think, is what I'm trying to get at here. Our interpretation of the world and our interpretation of what free will may well be flawed because it is predetermined somewhere else. And a lot of scientists who are very, what we call hard-line determinists, the hard determinists, will say all of these things are illusion if we cannot pin them back to a natural law. There's a cause and there's an effect. And if we can't demonstrate that connection, then we can't prove it, that it exists. And therefore it's probably an illusion. Oh dear, you're not here tonight at all.
Goodness. This is so rich. I feel like we could ricochet off in any direction at any moment. I just wanted to ask, if we're talking about rationality and sentience and self-recognition, if we can go a bit back to the animals and to mechanisms and mechanistic beings, and whether in the future, the kind of digital robotic age, whether human prostheses or robots will have ultimately complete free will because they are completely rational. What do you think, Tim?
Well, this is a good. Well, no, in a way, it is a question we're already having to puzzle with and battle with, because AI is becoming independent in all sorts of ways, and of course, some things like Terminator and the Battle of the Machines and so on, where we're actually going to be at a point where we have created an artificial intelligence that can think for itself and therefore have a free will. And the free will may decide, the machine may decide that human beings are really a rather useless species and we should be removed. Now, of course, we try and build into our artificial intelligence all sorts of behaviors within the algorithm, which, the famous one, you can't do any harm to a human being, would prevent that happening. But there's a point at which artificial intelligence will be able to make decisions. And I've no doubt this is going to happen, if not in my lifetime, at some point, where they will be able to make those decisions and exercise what we would say is free will, where they will rationally make a choice to do one thing or the other. They will be the agent and not a human being in making that decision. So, and taking us back, because I know you're very interested in this, Nina, with animals as well. We see animals do things, and although I was saying earlier, often it's about survival in one way or another. There's elements of behavior in animals which suggest they are making choices, that they are making choices themselves. And how do they come to make those choices if they don't have a capacity to have to make that choice, no free will, no consciousness. How do they actually do that? What determines that? Is it an illusion that we are being, in that sense, I suppose, anthropomorphic, in the sense we're putting onto animals behaviors which they don't really have? Because we like to see, when the dog comes up, we say, oh, the dog really likes us and it's really keen to see us, whereas actually, of course, all it wants is some food, and it knows that you're a source of food. It has no emotion for you. I'm being provocative here, but you see the point of the line I'm going down. There are motivations which we may not understand, but we may attribute to something else, and that can be also the idea of free will. We may attribute free will to a choice that we made, an action we've done, but actually something in our psyche, in our background, in the laws of nature, in our ancestors, in predetermination has made that happen. And we're just excluding that. We don't want to be aware of that, so we exclude that and say, no, I've thought this through. One of the areas where that's very interesting is in the area of finance and economics. And finance and economics, people have always thought this is the most rational area of all, because you're going to make decisions that are going to benefit you financially. And particularly in a capitalist world, what else are you making those decisions on? Well, there's a Nobel Prize winner called Daniel Kahneman, American, who won the Nobel Prize for demonstrating that most financial decisions, particularly in the Western economics, are made on emotional grounds, which are not rational at all. So emotion, again, driving us, and we won't necessarily recognize that emotion. We say, oh, we'll rationalize that decision, even though I've just given away £40,000 to a scammer on the telephone.
Yeah, and then on the other hand, there's the group think. I'm thinking of the Börse collapse in Germany, where everyone just threw their money, and whether we can talk about free will when it comes to a group, the herd mentality.
Well, yes, and group behavior is anthropologists are very interesting in that, because what are we getting from that? And there are all sorts of motivations. We're getting good feedback from our colleagues. We get loved for behaving in the same way. Or if you're in a employment situation, you're going to agree with the boss because you don't want to get sacked and so on. And that stimulates this idea of groupthink, so that sometimes it's very difficult. And then there's also in some senses, the emotional behavior. You can see it in crowds and football behavior, and sometimes in awful vandalism and bad behavior, because somehow the individual responsibility in decision making has disappeared, and you're caught up psychologically in this emotion, which can be highly stimulating. The dopamine is running high in you, and you're just rushing off. But rationally, and in terms of making a choice, it's not free will, because you've been just caught up with it psychologically. Yet it won't keep you out of court. If you've done something wrong, you will be punished for joining in. But that's sort of group thinking at its most extreme.
Yeah, and just leading on slightly from that point, in terms of the emotions versus rationality, in Brexit, without any prosthesis or implants or anything super futuristic, we kind of chanced across this data-driven determinism, as it were, or a kind of algorithmic oracly saying that this was going to happen or this wasn't going to happen. Data mine predictions, polls, all sorts. And what are the prospects for autonomy and imagination and freedom in this kind of well, I want to say brave, but actually it's not brave. It's kind of a shady new world, and about kind of things that we can't run away from, that are popping into our news feeds. Sorry, this is social media, Tim. Tell me if it's too far.
You're freezing there. I think the interconnection got very unstable. I don't know if everybody else could hear that. I lost the last part, I'm afraid, Nina.
No, I wasn't saying anything.
Instability.
Basically, what does the data-driven determinism and algorithms mean for the prospects of autonomy and free will in this century?
Well, yes, and of course they're based. It's the same old story, isn't it? It's like with all artificial intelligence and computers at the moment, until they exercise that free will we talked about. At the moment, they're only as good as the data and what is put into them. and therefore they react in a way that they've been programmed. And we've seen in certain cases that can be totally disastrous for the economics of the world and the way it operates. So there are great dangers with these algorithms, and we can see them at a personal level in what people know about us, the data they know about us, and how they compute. And at the same time, of course, they're very convenient for organizations to target, whether it's commercial for their sales or whether it's government for their understanding and so on. So there are a lot of risks involved in trying to, in a sense, predetermine through those algorithms what behavior is going to be. I still think the intuitive element that we all carry is still what's most important to us. Even if it's an illusion and that we still believe we have free will, then we're able to exercise that to some extent. And that, after all, that's what our whole political and legal systems are based on, this democratic ability to make those not always right decisions. And the majority is not always right, but nevertheless, they're given the mechanisms by which to do that. How are we doing? We've probably done an hour. Have we got some questions coming up?
We haven't got many more questions actually, but I would invite anyone, if you've got any question, big or small, they are most welcome to say. So I say, you're taking us on such a journey, Tim, and I feel like there's so much to this that we haven't even covered. I would love to go back a little bit to the black hole idea and what you kind of intimated about they're finding black matter where they didn't think they would find it. So virtual black holes, and these tiny particles, so up to 100 billion times smaller than the nucleus of an atom, and in them we lose particles and information at any point. And then these particles that come out are random, so it suggests that we can calculate probability but not find definite predictions. And that, of course, goes against this age-old, or at least up to the 20th century, idea that the state of the universe at one time determines the state of the universe at all other times. And that was a central kind of tenet at science, that once you found one equation, you could rely upon it. But then Stephen Hawking is saying, well, of course, science keeps surprising us with things, and I wonder whether with free will and this idea that one thing is for definite, it leads us down a kind of into complacency and into getting too hung up on one destination, and whether that diminishes our responsibility for important things.
Well, the compatibilists will say it's compatible to have, yes, that level of determination in the natural laws that are governing the world, governing us, but also to, if you like, to have another world on top of that, where we as individuals have some control and make some decisions for ourselves. So that philosophical school doesn't see a contradiction between those two. It sees that, in fact, the contradiction itself, and sometimes this is understandable, the contradiction itself is more of a reality. But trying to make it one thing or the other. People say there's no such thing as determinism. We're totally free. We can do whatever we want. Don't worry about that. Whereas the hard determinists will say, well, the laws of nature are there, even if, and it goes back to your point, even if we don't, they are. So, okay, there was Newtonian physics, fine. Along comes Einstein, smashes that. Einstein didn't get it entirely right, and who's going? Where are we going to go next? We will discover what appears to be random behaviour of subnuclear particles. We will work out what's going on there when we understand the laws behind it. But we're still at the moment grappling with that. And of course, these huge colliders, both in America and in Europe, all the time, trying to discover new things, and they have discovered new particles, and they will discover, I'm no doubt, in the future there will be an understanding of new laws on how things operate. Just only the other day, NASA announced that they've understood a bit more about how the sun heats up and when it explodes, why it in certain ways, and something entirely new. Now, they've been able to do that because of space exploration getting nearer, and as we do more in our cosmos, I guess, the more we will understand it. How that necessarily relates to free will, well, it probably just hardens the hard determinists.
Yeah. And we have another question actually from Hannah that was returning a bit to our social media point, whether social media has become, in a way, with all its own algorithms and pixels, this kind of black hole that doesn't remember things and that doesn't return information. It only spouts things out which repeat in your own very short term, very small bubble. And whether that eliminates any element of free will that we might intuitively think we have, and whether it does control us.
That's a very interesting question, in the sense that we're discovering all the ills of social media in terms of bubbles where we only talk to our own group, in terms of also, I suppose, really the objectionable things that come through in terms of social media and how it, but also the huge influence it has. And there was data coming out today about children, 11-year-old children, very fixed on social media because it kept them in contact with their friends. But of course, it's also influencing them. And what you were saying about groupthink, in terms of how people think, and we've seen the power that social media has in creating changes in attitudes. So it is a powerful tool, and not always easy to be able to stand back from, I think, if once you start getting involved. And there's elements of, again, emotion that is so powerful, friendship with other people who think the same way, or then the anger that you have, and you can express in an anonymous way, the anger you have at someone else's opinion. And we saw, quite recently, we've had these cricketers who in their youth have been sending off sexist and racist messages and so on. People acting in an emotional way without thinking through the consequences of their words in a longer term. So there are elements there where people are maybe exercising their free will, but not actually in a very rational way, but much more in that emotional way that I've been talking about. So, going back with hindsight, they would not behave in that way.
Yeah. I also
There's
have
a question coming in.
Yes. Oh, you mentioned, Libet. Do you think...
That's right,
yes.
Benjamin Libet, yes.
Do you think his experiments related to real free will, i.e. rational, meaningful actions, rather than a meaningless action of just when to raise your hand or press a button?
Well, that's a fair point. It's not very sophisticated yet at this stage, and because we don't know enough about the brain, I guess. I mean, neuroscience has made huge advances, but a lot of the brain is still, with neurons and synapses and things firing off, is still a bit of a mystery. We're being able to count it better, and we're able to understand parts of the brain and how they influence our behavior and our thinking and so on. So we're beginning to pin that down in a better way. But there haven't been, as far as I'm aware, and I'm not an expert, obviously, in neuroscience in this area, there haven't been experiments yet to take us beyond the stage of doing something like making a quick choice on a game or something like that. They haven't gone into deeper consideration about a free will decision, whether to act as an agent in something much more sophisticated. These are quite simple things, I think.
I have another question just about women and how we've been through Hobbes, Aristotle, Hume, Stephen Hawking. Can't help but notice, of course, history is his story to an extent, but where do women come into this picture? Are we so objectively unfree that it's not really our department? And within theology as well, the Bible is written by men. It's got God and Jesus. It's a very male dominated, and so where do women begin to kind of explore notions of free will? Not to completely gender the issue, but I think it is a significant point.
Well, there's sort of two ways of coming to that. One, of course, is most cultures have been very patriarchal societies. So, and making decisions for women in those patriarchal societies. And as we've moved in a more economically balanced society, that has been less so in Western culture terms, and women can make more decisions for themselves. The other, the biological response to that will be there also that, of course, as male and female, we are programmed, and there's a big argument, it's the usual nature-nurture argument about programming. How much is nature, how much is nurture? But we are programmed. If we take the nature argument, the programming for women will be very connected inevitably with reproduction. And decisions there are made for the protection of the reproduction sequence. So women and mothers' love is absolutely crucial, for example, in terms of the survival of infants. We may see that as less so now, but clearly through most of our history, and culturally embedded and psychologically embedded, is mother's love. We tend to think we're very sophisticated at this little period of civilization, this tiny period of 3,000, or if we can stretch it back even 5,000 years, whereas human beings have been around for over 200, Homo sapiens sapiens, for 200,000 years. And prior to that, we had ancestors who were also Homo gens, going back into the millions of years, 2.5 million years. So a lot of our behavior in that sense has been sequenced from there. So women's, putting it starkly, prime purpose in life has been reproduction and the survival of the infant to the next stage. So there's both the social one with the patriarchal element, but there's also a biological one which may have conditioned women's ability in terms of free will. Do you have free will if your child is threatened? No, you react emotionally, and certainly also you would find that true with fathers, but probably not so much. And certainly in many societies, fathers are not so important. It can become fairly redundant. Generally, pair bonding has been perceived as the most successful way, and obviously through our history has demonstrated that pair bonding and joint responsibility seem the most successful for bringing up children, but actually that's been altered. And mother's love, I think, certainly for anthropologists, is seen as absolutely key in terms of how the species has developed. I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah, no, of course. I think that there's a lot.
Carry on. You're free to say anything. You're free to make up.
Yeah, no, thank you. I mean, I kept having thoughts, and then they popped in one ear and came out the other. But I was just thinking of women who historically have shown free will in real life. So the York murderers. If you betray your maternal instinct, you're demonized in the way that actually men, if they say free will, it's kind of like a hero's journey, and it's like, oh great, you broke away from conventional morality and bad faith. And I was thinking,
you raised something there, Nina. You raised something there. I'll just pick up, really interesting. It popped into your head, thought, and there is an American psychologist, Sam Harris, who argues that, for example, in terms of free will, we have no control over our thoughts. They just happen. They come into our head, and then we may consider them and we may roll them about, but we don't actually control them. And I used to say this to my students, and I probably could have said it tonight. You're listening to a talk, a lecture. You've only got actually 9 minutes of concentrated thought, and after that, anything can happen. You might be thinking about what you're going to eat, when you're going to meet your boyfriend, your girlfriend, what you're going to do. These thoughts come into our heads randomly almost. And this is Sam Harris's point. He will say, we don't choose these. We may think we're agents and we're choosing, but the thoughts are coming at us. And this demonstrates that we don't actually have control. And to demonstrate free will, we have to have control. We don't really have control.
Yeah.
We're reacting. It's an illusion that we build on top of this, that, oh yes, everything's carefully thought through and planned. No, we react and then we rationalize. So the reaction and the rationalization.
Definitely. And I mean, according to a lot of men in history, then women didn't rationalize. They were the irrational being, almost like Descartes' mechanistic animals. Women were kind of in that same other category. So it's really interesting. We've gone a big round circle there. we've got a couple more questions in the meantime, so maybe we'll just go through them. I hope everyone's still engaged and learning things as we go on this very
Surviving.
not predetermined, or maybe. So we've got a question about the more whether there's an equivalent in more Eastern Orthodox traditions to this deterministic Western Christian position put forward by Old Augustine and his colleagues. You can say that, years apart, decades apart, centuries.
Well, yes. I mean, in a sense, I'm not. Before the church split, of course, there were the church councils which determined what the creed of the church was, and the differences in terms of relationship with God have been only very minor, and usually actually have involved Jesus rather than God himself. So the Orthodox Church has a similar view in terms of the power of God in his omniscience and his omnipotence, and that those are still there. And it is again the grace of God that determines whether you will be saved or not saved. On the other hand, there's a greater emphasis perhaps, and you can see this through particularly in terms of the monastic orders that have survived in the Orthodox Church, that it's the getting close to God and that relationship which is what's important, rather than trying to save yourself, because that's in God's hands. But it's understanding that conversation that you can have with God, which is important. And at the layman's level, communication with God again is crucial. Whether that's through prayers or in the Orthodox Church, of course, it's also done very much visually through icons. And you probably, I don't know if there's any Orthodox members of tonight joining us, but if you go to an Orthodox church, you will understand that kissing that icon is a way of actually connecting with God in a way that in the Western church is rather different. So it's like almost like a semaphore. The icon acts as a signal, and you go through the icon. It's not that you're worshipping the icon; you're worshipping God through the icon. It's a means of communication, like Wi-Fi to God. Or Wi-Fi. That's a better analogy. Wi-Fi to God.
Yeah. We have got another question from. Well, we had one from Mike as well about meditation or perhaps prayer if it's in a religious setting, whether you can slow and stop those thoughts, which you said were kind of that we can't control. When we do achieve that kind of slowing down, does that prove to any extent that we do have control and free will, or is it still is that a kind of method of bypassing or of cheating the system?
Well, it's interesting, isn't it? And back to, and if we take the big dilemma for human beings is that we're conscious, but all the time we can't predict the future. So arbitrary things can happen to us and be inflicted upon us. And we have to sort of react to those. So one of the whole areas behind ascetics movements is to get control of yourself. Can't control the outside world, but if you can control yourself, then you have some way of predicting what will happen. Of course, it's limited because you can't predict when you're going to die, and you can't predict the normal elements that happen to mortality. So there's an element of, yes, of through meditation or through what ascetic means you take to get control of yourself, and that makes you more in charge of your world. Now, I'm not sure that's absolutely true, but it means that you have a greater understanding of yourself within that world. And in fact, many aesthetic movements, they are reducing the actions of human beings to nothing. They're returning them to actually. So whether that counts as a free will to be nothing, maybe that is a choice that you make. But it's I don't think it frees you entirely from all those thoughts. And I suppose you have to think about some of the ascetic saints in the Christian world who would want to go into the desert and try and escape, but they still can't escape those thoughts. And often, of course, many of those thoughts were to do with the things of the flesh, and therefore were seen as sinful. that it goes back. That's interesting because you raised that thing about women being closer to nature. Certainly, the Greeks thought that women were part of nature and therefore to be feared because nature was uncontrollable. So there's that element of nature that yes, is to be feared because it's uncontrollable, but also, of course, it's life-giving. It's the force of the world. So there's a paradox there. You can't do without it, but you quite like to control it, and that is part, I suppose, of the patriarchal image. Although tendency is for sociologists to see patriarchy more as a financial thing of inheritance and passing on wealth and controlling that rather than necessarily being a psychological one. But the two probably are linked; they go hand in hand.
Yeah. And speaking of inheritance and that kind of coming back to that cyclical idea that women kind of coughed up, we've got a comment from Gabrielle saying, given how fundamental to the survival of the species the maternal instinct is, it's interesting, at least in the human species, to see how rapidly women have made alternative choices once alternative became available. So contraception, economic freedom. And I have a slight comment on this one, and it was just that I was really interested in my final year looking at various literatures, so novels, and how they kind of explored this idea of free will or the interaction of mythological, environmental, historical time on a bigger scale in the way that the traditional kind of moral free will adventure just doesn't look at. And it reminds me, Phil, when you said a butterfly wing claps in this kind of chaos theory of there's an equal and opposite reaction somewhere else. And brilliant Nobel Prize winning author Olga Tokarczuk writes in a really sprawling, cyclical way. And also I think of Gabriel Marquez and his 100 Years in Solitude. And there's this sense, not necessarily of free will or determinism, but it's something else. It's this mythology, and it brings us back as well to tragedy in this sense that there's such a conflict and a pushing and shoving between fate and free will. Yeah.
And the whole, yes, it takes us back to the whole area of what we're fated to. Can I just go back and deal with that question about gender, which is an interesting one, I think, in terms of where we are now, because I think that's what that question was getting at in terms of women having more freedom to exercise choice as to whether they want children or they don't want children and so on. And of course, we are an age of individualism in all sorts of ways. I'm going to be talking about art in my third session, and the expression of the individual is now what drives art. Whereas previously it was what the patron paid for, or what the religion required, and now it's the personal, the individual. And I think that element of individuality, in fact, does exaggerate the idea that we should have free will, that we can do things ourselves and have choices and do the other, rather than be contained by cultural norms. And child rearing, lovely though those little children are, is incredibly demanding and takes over people's lives. That's and now we're offered a cornucopia of other opportunities. It's not surprising. There's probably also a natural balance going on as well in terms of just how successful Homo sapiens has been in populating the planet, and how that now, as David Attenborough would tell us, has become a problem. It's become a crisis for us. So there's probably several things going on there that are influencing apparent choices. But are they an illusion? Are they predetermined in terms of what will happen to the human species?
Yes, indeed. And so perhaps then a final question. I mean, we've said it in various ways probably. But does free will, do you think, really exist, Tim?
Yes. Well, it's very interesting, and this is where there is an analogy with religion, isn't there? Because it comes back to a belief. We can't prove that it exists, and we can't prove that it doesn't exist. So if we take the scientific approach, there's no proof one way or the other. We might say not proven, as they would in a Scottish court. And there's therefore the beliefs to choose from, whether you can believe the libertarians, it's totally free will, or the compatibilists, well, there's a bit, or the hard determinists. There's no free will. You take your choice. The balance has changed slightly, and I think this is what's happened certainly in my area of anthropology. The balance has changed. When I went into anthropology, the key drivers were seen to be nurture and culture, and then genetics came in, and DNA, and so on, and the balance has changed. But I don't think you'd find any anthropologists saying, "Oh, it's just genes that forms the next person," or just DNA, and we've got no other. There's no cultural influence or external influences. So I suspect, in terms of free will, there's a balance going on there. And although some of our free will may be very emotionally driven and a bit of an illusion, there's still our ability to make important decisions for ourselves, and there are choices that we make all the time. So I'm more on the compatibilist, if you like, and in terms of the spectrum, I'm more on the compatibilist spectrum than anywhere else. The fence, some people will call it.
I love to be on the fence. That's where you can find me, having a cup of tea. Right. Well, on that note, I think we will wrap up. Thank you so much, Tim. That has been so interesting. I feel like I've really been put through my paces. Questions of good and evil.
No, thanks so much for agreeing to take part, Nina. It's been really great. You've been really great. That's fantastic. And thanks to our silent audience. If they're still there, thanks to them for hanging in.
Brilliant.
Yes, I would also just like to say a massive thank you to both Tim and Nina for a wonderful whistle-stop tour of how the free will debate has been interpreted throughout the centuries, and also how these questions relate to like modern political issues of agency, freedom, and moral responsibility. So I want to say a big thank you to both of you for just exploring that debate so thoroughly. And also to our audience for supporting the Cathedral and Conservation 50 through attending. I just wanted to quickly plug upcoming events with the Study Centre. In particular, I want everyone to watch this space and keep your eye open for Tim's upcoming talk, which will be the third instalment of the History of Western Art. So we haven't decided a date for that yet, but I would just like you to keep watching and aware of everything that's going on with the Study Centre, just so you don't miss that, because it promises to be fascinating. I would also like to say to you to please email us if you want to be added to the mailing list, just so you can keep abreast of all the new events we've got coming up. And finally, we'd love to know what you think of our talks and events. So if you have just a few moments, and I do promise it is only a few moments to spare, please take another look at your welcome email and click on the button which says feedback. That would be brilliant. Thank you very much. And thank you again to Tim and Nina. And if everyone wants to take themselves off.
Remember, no one forced you to come. It was free will.
Yes.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you very much.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Thanks, Tim. Thank
Bye.
you.
Bye. I'll see you tomorrow, Katie.
Oh, yes. Brilliant. See you tomorrow. Bye. Thank you.
Bye.